For those of you who are unfamiliar with ethical culture, we're a humanist congregational movement about 150 years old, dedicated to exploring the ways in which we can live meaningful and ethical lives. Unlike a traditional religious group, there is no supernatural content to our services. But that said, there's no requirement of belief or non-belief in our movement. That is a matter between you and your conscience. Our motto is deed before creed. We believe that how you live and act in life is more important than any creed you might espouse. This morning, I'll be interviewing our two guests, Elaine Howard Ecklund and David R. Johnson. I'll be interviewing them about their 2019 book, Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion, published by Oxford University Press, and written with their fellow sociologists, Brendan Vaidyanathan, Kristen Matthews, Stephen Lewis, Robert Thompson, and Dee. And I'll introduce them both more fully a little bit later. First, I would like to ask Ron Schwartz from our membership committee to make a short announcement. Ron, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to welcome everybody, especially new members, to our Sunday morning platform. We're very busy here at Ethical Culture in Bergen County. We're doing a lot of great things. So if you're interested in learning more about ethical culture in Bergen County, let us know in the chat and we'll contact you, or let David know. And someone from the membership committee, either myself or somebody else, will contact you and we'll talk. Thanks a lot, David.
Okay, I'm happy to say we have some music today, and I'm going to call on Ron Schwartz again to introduce it. Go ahead, Ron.
Thanks, David. We're going to bring you recorded music from the Lenny Goldstein Hits Factory that was recorded yesterday, actually, at the building. So we got back into the building and we were able to make use out of our building. So this is a song called Thirsty Boots by Eric Anderson. And it relates to a lot of people out there from ethical culture and in the movement that have been working virtually their whole lives that I've known for social justice and other causes, and are kind of exhausted at the present time. I know a lot of my friends from ethical culture and elsewhere are exhausted by the fact that they've had to put up to save our democracy and other things in the last couple of years. So this song is about being exhausted, but having a community and friends to come back to and to resource and recharge with. And I think that's what ethical culture provides for many people. It's a place where you can be with people who have the same value system that you are to recharge. So the chorus is, and you can sing along while you're on mute, take off your thirsty boots and stay for a while. Your feet are hot and weary, you've come a dusty mile. Maybe I can make you laugh and maybe I can try. Just looking for the evening and the morning in your eyes. So take it away. 1, 2, 3. We've long been on the open road. You've been sleeping in the rain. From the dirt of words and the mud of cells, your clothes are dark and stained. By the dirt of words and the mud of cells, will soon be judged the same. So only stop to rest yourself, and you'll be off again. Then take off your thirsty boots and stay for a while. Feet are hot and weary from a dusty mile. Maybe I can make you laugh, and maybe I can try. Looking for the evening and the morning in your eyes. Oh, to tell me of the ones you've seen, as far as you could see, across the plains from fields to town and marching to be free, and of the rusty prison gates that tumble by degree, like laughing children, one by one, they look like you and me. Oh, then take off thirsty boots and stay for a while. Feet are hot and weary from a dusty mile.
maybe I can make you laugh, and maybe I can try. Just looking for the evening and the morning in your eyes. And I know you are no stranger now, crooked rainbow trail from Maine to Clifford Shackleton, slander shackled dress. But the voices drift up from below as the walls are being scaled. All of this and more, my friend, the song shall not be failed. Then take off your thirsty boots and stay for a while. Feet are high and weary from a dusty mile. Maybe I can make you laugh, and maybe I can try. Just looking for the evening and the morning in your eyes. Oh, then take off your thirsty boots and stay for a while. Feet are high and weary from a dusty mile. And maybe I can make you laugh, and maybe I can try. Looking for the evening and the morning in your eyes. Just looking for the evening and the morning in your eyes. Take off your thirsty boots, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Len and Ron. That was terrific. There are a lot of great comments in the chat window. I hope you had a chance to see them. Thank you. I'd like to introduce our speakers who really they'll be interviewed this morning. Professors Elaine Howard Ecklund and David R. Johnson came out with a book in 2019 called Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. And it was written with a number of co-authors as sociologists, who are all sociologists, excuse me. And in that book, they report the results of the largest international study of scientists' attitudes towards religion ever undertaken. Elaine Howard Eklund is the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology, and Director of the Religion and Public Life Program at Rice University in Houston. David R. Johnson is an Assistant Professor of Higher Education Leadership at the University of Nevada in Reno in the College of Education, and he specializes in the sociology of higher education, work, and organizations and science. Now, I'd like to lead off with a question for both of you, and that is, tell us what this book is about, why you undertook this study, and why you think it's important. And we can go with Dr. Eklund first.
First, thank you for having us. I would say I'm already enjoying myself a great deal, which I think speaks to the warmth and hospitality of the group that is communicated even over Zoom, which I think is hard to pull off. I've been to lots of group gatherings over Zoom, and I just want to say that and just affirm that. So we I think there's the academic answer to your question, which goes something like this: that scientists have forever been seen as the purveyors of a kind of secularity of the world, and especially of higher education and science itself. And some of the practical consequences of that kind of belief is that perhaps religious children, don't go into science because they think that scientists are kind of uniformly against them. I would say another kind of practical output of such a perspective is that scientists themselves even tend to believe that there's one kind of atheism in science, even for those who are not religious, rather than understanding a more nuanced perspective of their colleagues. And so I think that's where we come along as sociologists. So we're very interested in group behaviors and whether or not who people actually are and who they think they are lines up with the prevalent beliefs in society about groups of people. And that was really the fun of doing this research, is that we did a survey of over 22,000 scientists, and I should say biologists and physicists were the two groups that we turned our attention to, in 8 different national contexts, and lots of follow-up in-depth interviews, over 600 interviews with scientists in these national contexts. And I think some of the academic assumptions about the scientific community that were out there were really blown away, but also at a very real personal level, some of our own assumptions, I think, were, and we can get into that later if you want to talk about that.
I will.
I think we're blown away as well. Yeah, David, what would you add to that?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for inviting us today. And I have to say, I don't know what you do professionally, David, but you have a voice made for radio. You've got a really good interviewer's voice.
I know. I was actually sitting here thinking that same thing. You all, both of the two folks who are leading, really great voices. So glad this is recorded. Sorry to interrupt you, David.
So I think Elaine covered all the significant bases there, but with respect to the issue of why this book and this work is important, the two things that I'd add is one, it's important for anyone. It's important for public attitudes towards science, and the hope is that a book like this might erode myths that people have, such as the idea that all scientists are hostile to religion. And the reason that sort of myth is problematic is because it's consequential for other concerns, and this is the second matter of importance, things like diversity in science. If you're somebody who's concerned about equity and diversity in science, those myths can be harmful because they communicate to a large number of groups, especially minority groups, that they're not welcome in that community. And so I think the book is important, not only for the academic reasons that intersect with concerns about secularization in society, but especially because of public attitudes towards science and issues of equity and diversity in science.
Oh, this is a good lead into something I wanted to mention about why I was so interested in having you come, why I have a personal interest in this. And I think this will be something that many of our members can share. In 1997, I think it was, I was humbled considerably by a survey that I read about by Edward Larson and Larry Witham, who did a study on scientists' attitudes towards religion. And he repeated a study that was done in 1914, asking the same questions. And now at that time, I've been an atheist since I was 13 years old. And I was frankly pretty arrogant about it. And I got the shock of my life when I discovered that there were serious scientists, members of the National Academy of Sciences, no less, who didn't just believe in God, they believed in a personal God. I was flabbergasted at that, and it really humbled me. And so that's when I got interested in this whole topic. And when I heard about your work, I was very interested in this. So I'd like you to tell us what countries you looked at. And that will also explain why there's such a long list of co-authors. I read that list earlier. What countries did you look at? And I would want to follow up with the question that I think America has this most hard-nosed attitude about science and atheism, and that's not the case in other countries, in all other countries. So if you could talk about that. First, what countries did you look at, and what are the major findings? Why don't you go ahead?
Those are all huge questions, and
Yeah.
Elaine and I are pretty good at deciding how we're going to go back and forth with questions.
Okay.
But we we selected 8 countries, and from west to east, it was the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, France, Turkey, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and India. I got the east-west geography a little bit mixed up there. But we selected those countries for a number of reasons, but there was 2 primary orienting ideas that drove the case selection. Primarily, we selected the countries because we needed to have a diverse sample of religious traditions and religious cultures. And as you sort of got at in your comment, the different cultures of science and religion in the public sphere. And so, as you noted, those earlier studies of scientists in the United States were primarily, well, they were those scientists, the studies that you were referencing exclusively focused on scientists in the United States, and not only scientists in the United States, but the most elite scientists. And that presents a very Christian-centric and Western-specific view of how people think about the relationship between religion and science. And sociologists think of religion and conceptualize religion in a multitude of ways, but we wanted to make sure that we had a diversity of religious traditions across these contexts, with highly secular contexts like France and the United Kingdom as a type of case, highly religious contexts in the West like the United States as a type of case, and then of course, Eastern religions in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and India. And then the other broad orienting idea was that not only do countries vary in terms of their religious characteristics, they also vary in terms of their science infrastructures, in terms of whether or not they're highly developed and advanced or at the core of the global science infrastructure, or maybe less developed, let's say. So those were the 2 big ideas that guided our selection of cases. Elaine, what would you add to that, if anything?
That's right. The only thing I would add with relationship to religion is that the different national contexts and regional contexts have different kinds of religious expression, different orientations between religion and the state. And so the social context of each of these nations with relationship to religion, who is religious, how the state thinks about religion is really different. And so I'm going to do my best to just give you a sentence overview of some of the main findings in each of the national contexts with relationship to that. So, and then David Bland, maybe follow up, with what
Sure.
you would like to drill down on. In the United States, this is where we all are now. We have a situation where there is not a state religion, but yet there is a huge group of Christians. So there's a dominant Christian perspective. And there is sometimes the perception and the reality of conflict between certain types of science and certain religious groups, especially evangelical Christians, although that's a more recent phenomenon than a historic phenomenon. You also have in the US a situation where we don't talk about this probably as much as we should, but there's a browning of Christianity. There's a huge number of immigrants and immigrant churches, and also, of course, a really dominant perspective of Black churches and involvement in issues of social justice. So that's, and a real underrepresentation of minorities in science. And so there's a lot going on in the US context, and maybe you're interested. In the UK, you have a situation where there is a state church, and that there has been historically within UK science scientists who have religious training, for example, through their what they would think of as a public school system. There's a lot of fear among UK scientists about the increase of Muslims in particular in science and what that will do to science. In France, you have an avid secularity where the state is trying to essentially protect itself from religion. And some of you on this call maybe know more about that history than we do. And just a real perception among certain groups of religious people in France that they really need to hide their religion because of that perceived secularity. In Turkey, you have a secular state, a Muslim populace, and the perception sometimes among scientists that they are not religious enough, that they are going to be perhaps denied funding because they don't follow the particular tenets of Islam or look at Islam in the same way that some do. In India, we have modal Hinduism with 79% of the population, and many of those folks thinking of themselves as culturally, not religiously Hindu, a kind of not present day, but holdover from a caste system where a particular type of Hindu is likely to go into science. And so that has lots of impact as well. In Hong Kong and Taiwan, some of our findings there, really interesting. We have among some groups in the science community, more religiosity than in the general population, which we think in Hong Kong is due perhaps to the relationship between missionization in Hong Kong and education, where some of the best educational institutions are actually Christian, specifically Catholic institutions. And so it's almost like religion provides a pipeline to science in this really intriguing way. And of course, you have Buddhism and secularity and lots of different things going on there as well. Taiwan is a very religiously pluralistic culture. And then you have there a situation where religion and discussions about religion seem to be much more accepted in some ways than even in the US, where there's more perceived religiosity. In Taiwan, there's a more accepted public expression and discussion within the scientific community.
You know,
I hope that was okay. That's like 15, that's like 5 years of research in 2 minutes, but that's it. That's
well
as
done.
best I could do.
Well done. And I want to mention for everybody else, there's a lot of really fascinating stuff in the book, and I encourage everyone to go get a copy. We can only touch on the major findings today. Normally we would, I'd interview you and then we'd open it up for questions, but I would like to actually tell people that if they have a question, to raise your hand in Zoom, raise your hand. I'll keep my eye on the participant list and we'll take your questions, because I think there'll be a lot of questions on this. Now, you're in the book, you make 4 big claims, which you've spoken of already, that around the world there are more religious scientists than we might think, that many scientists, even some atheist scientists, see spirituality in science, and that religion is not kept out of the scientific workplace everywhere, as it is in the United States. And the most startling claim to Americans, I think, and certainly to me, was that the conflict between religion and science is an invention of the West. Now, I'd like to focus on that for a minute. If you could explain why you say that. Now, you sort of touched on it already when you talked about other countries, but let's just go into that a little bit more. And I'll let you decide. David said you guys are good at figuring out who should talk, so I'm gonna leave it to you to do that.
I'll just start out and then David can jump in. So those are provocative claims, intentionally so. People ask me all the time, I've written several books about the religion and science interface, are religion and science really in conflict? I get this question often. And I always respond, well, it depends what kind of religion, it depends what kind of science. And I think something sociologists bring to these discussions, and what sadly has become really debates, is that we are most interested in what people actually do and what people actually think. and the generality of people's views rather than the loudest voices. And so we're going to ask questions like, what's typical? And so, and when you look across these 8 national and regional contexts, we do see that there does seem to be a kind of tension within some forms of Christianity, present day tension. I've talked with lots of Christian theologians and others who study the history of Christianity who tell me immediately, and I think this is probably accurate, it wasn't always that way. There's lots of historical record of and present day examples of Christian churches fostering science and scientific inquiry for sure. But there is within current everyday people this more of a perception of a conflict between some forms of science and between their Christian faith, and that needs to be very qualified very carefully. It's some forms of science and some scientific issues, not all, and that we just don't see these same kinds of tensions in the same way within other national contexts of scientists that we studied. So within India and Taiwan and Hong Kong, we just see very different kinds of conversation. So much so that when we interviewed scientists in those latter national contexts, we would say, so, some scientists think that there's a conflict between religion and science. And the folks would respond to us, why are you asking me this question? Like, this is a kind of silly question to be asking. Like, we don't think of these things as modal in that kind of way, as these separate kind of entities. So
can I just, apropos of that, I want to give a quote from the book. You wrote, as one Indian scientist shared, certainly when I was in the US, I can't think of a single conference that I attended where anything religious came up. I can relate to that. That's me. But there was one conference here, was one, meaning in India, there was one conference that I went to where the first thing that happened in the conference was an invocation of a particular god. So the goddess Saraswati is supposed to be the goddess of learning. And this particular conference was one of the meetings of the Indian Academy of Sciences, which is the largest scientific academy in the United States. And he went on to say that was not unusual. And as you point out, that would be unheard of in the United States or the UK. But I interrupted, I'm sorry.
No, I think you make a good point. And so, David, I don't want to take all the air. Maybe you want to jump in at this point, but this to finish off that thought. There is not, so we set up social interactions and social structures in the US often around science with the assumption that there's going to be a conflict. And we saw in these other national contexts that where we studied scientists that often there was not that assumption because the bodies of knowledge were viewed as connecting to one another in very different ways. So yeah, Dave, did you want to add anything?
Just the main thing that I would add to clarify for everybody listening is the way that we arrive at the claim that conflict is an invention of the West is that we have a survey question that we asked of everybody who participated in the study, which asks how they view the relationship between religion and science. And you can answer that you view it as one of conflict and you take the side of science. You can say that you view it as one of conflict and you take the side of religion, which almost nobody did. You can say that you view them as completely independent of one another, which is sort of indicative of the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria, that science asks questions related to how and religion asks questions related to why. And you could answer that you view the relationship as one of collaboration, that somehow science and religion can inform or work with one another. And basically what we found is that the dominant view for scientists across the 8 nations that we studied is one of independence. For example, it's highest in France and Italy at roughly 2/3 of scientists viewing it that way. And I think one of the most surprising findings for me working on this study was that the conflict finding was so low, even in highly secular contexts like France and the United Kingdom. The conflict view never exceeds more than 1/3 of the attitudes of scientists in any of the given contexts that we studied. And collaboration view was less pronounced, but we do see that it's more likely in Eastern countries, especially in places like Turkey, India, and Hong Kong and Taiwan. And so that's the survey question, is how we arrive at a representative claim about what scientists think. And then we sit down with scientists and try and understand what they mean and how they think about the relationship in a way that you can't capture on the survey.
Okay, we have several people with their hands up. Dan Rosenblum, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Sure, thank you. This sounds really, really interesting. So as I was looking at your list of countries, I noticed that there was nothing from either Latin America or Africa. And of course, Africa has a particularly rich set of religious traditions from pre-colonial days. And I realized that thanks to colonialism, science in those countries is not as developed as it is across the North American, European, Asian swath, but still, it's there and growing. So, sort of a two-part question. One, do you have plans to expand this research to cover some of those areas south of the equator, besides South Asia? And two, on a related note, it's a very small fraction of the world's population, but disproportionately represented among scientists. People of Jewish background clearly, as I say, are disproportionately represented among scientists. There's a huge range in Jewish practice and belief, from staunch atheists and secularists to Haredi Orthodox people. Any thoughts, and also, as I say, disproportionately represented among scientists, any thoughts on looking at that particular population and of scientists and its views on religion and science? Thanks.
How about David? I'll take, just to get some more questions, I'll take this one and then you can take the next one. Is that okay? So what you say is exactly right on both counts. So we do not include African national context. We of course didn't include countries in Australia as well, but so we did not include South America, and those are enormous gaps in this study. After you have theoretic reasons for choosing particular national context, then the choice becomes very practical, and we couldn't scale up the study to be that large. And those were the national contexts that we had connections in and sort of met our sampling needs. But I absolutely agree that we should look, and other researchers should look to science and science connection to religion or lack of in other national contexts. It's extremely important work to consider for the future. There is a great book, there's several great books on Judaism and science, but there's one called New Wine in Old Wineskins. I don't know if you have, by a Cornell University Nobel Prize winner, that's really wonderful. And there's just a lot out there on Judaism and science that's mainly from a historic perspective, but we have done some drilling down in our data as well.
If you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself, we're having a little trouble muting you. We can't mute everyone, but we are getting some extraneous noise. Dan, since you brought up Africa, I want to relate a story. I have a very good friend who's a primatologist. He lives in the UK, but he spends 3 or 4 months pre-COVID. He spent 3 or 4 months a year in Mikumi National Park in Tanzania. And he and his wife's a statistician, and they had a doctoral student, from Tanzania. And and he was doing fine, but there was a problem. He didn't believe in evolution. Or I should say, he didn't believe in natural selection. And they were really kind of at a loss as to what to do about that. And I know that this issue is mentioned in the book, and maybe a little bit later we can come back to it, but I wanted to mention that now. Anu Podki, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Oh, hi. I am really enjoying this talk, and what you said about the scientists getting together and then they were praying to the goddess of wisdom, and that is really very common. I think United States, I never knew that there was such a big conflict between science and because many times I see that in India, all the modern science is kind of incorporated also in the pujas and everything. Like every year there is a festival when all the weapons were supposed to be kind of offered. Then we had factories, people started actually having the machines also as part of it. And there was absolutely no problem in using the new technology, I myself am very surprised that the Prime Minister of India today, who is actually known to be very religious fundamentalist, was the first one right now to promote the corona vaccine, and he was the first to take it publicly. So that's something and to tell you the truth, knowing the Hinduism, I'm still trying to figure out what kind of Hindu I am. So this is very common. The real question I have is, I remember reading a paper on this a long time ago, and for all I know, it was your paper, that you are saying that this religious versus science is more conflict in the Western world. But if we look at some of the German scientists before the World War II, had been also talking about the Hindu non-dualistic philosophy of the religion and the quantum mechanics. So the paper had been saying that the real problem of religion versus science became very much when the science came into the Anglosphere. As long as it was in the German sphere, it was not really such a big conflict. So I wanted to find out your thoughts on it.
Anu, I just want to say you have a little bit of an internet issue, I think. So sometimes you froze a little bit. So we may have missed
Oh,
some of that
okay.
question, but anyway, maybe it was just me. I'm
Yeah.
not sure, right?
Okay, I can repeat just the question very quickly. That
Yeah.
was the science versus religion, but when it was in the German sphere, there was actually a lot of talk about especially quantum mechanics and the non-dualistic religion of India, and there was not much of a conflict between the religion and
I'm sorry, I had a little bit of difficulty in capturing the question, so I'm going to riff a little bit on what I did here, and just say that one of the privileges I had in working on this project was that I got to travel to many of these countries to sit down with scientists and have these conversations. And with my colleague Brandon Vaidyanathan, spent 2 weeks in India, in Kolkata, Mumbai, and Bangalore, or excuse me, New Delhi. And one of the things that was so fascinating was just how much religion seemed to permeate science and how there weren't these rigid boundaries in place between religion and science there. You noted something about non-dualistic views of religion. And one of the things that we did not survey scientists about this, but one of the narratives that we picked up on in interviews is that my sense was that some of the reason that conflict is less pronounced in a case like India is because there are many scientists that we spoke with who have views that where God is in everything, and in some way, shape, or form, that means that God can be in science, however they define it. Um, and I think that was one of the sort of narratives we heard that I wish we could have tried to understand better in a survey in terms of its relationship to conflict. Elaine, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
No, and just to say that it's really important that for this kind of study, we do both survey methods and interview and observational methods, because even conceptualizing what religion is. And I think the comments that were made at the open of this session speak to some of that, that there's some kinds of tension of us even conceptualizing what it means to be religious. And survey questions are very necessarily limited in that regard, right? Because the researcher must decide a priori how to define religion so she can ask the large group of people. And we must ask, to some extent, the same questions in every national context to have comparability, while at the same time, recognizing that validity, so making sure you're studying the phenomenon you think you're studying, is really happening. So you need to be attentive to the different kinds of cultural conceptions in each national context. And that was the great fun of this study, actually. Like, I think David and I both really enjoyed that, but also the extreme difficulty of pulling off a study like this in a way that is nuanced. And so I think Anu's great points speak to some of that there's those tensions methodologically because of the different substantive meanings of what it even means to be religious.
And ideally, you would have your team would be not only an expert on religion or on science, but also an expert on each of the contexts that you're studying. But that's for when you're doing a study that's international and comparative, that's sort of challenging.
Well, that's partly why you had so many co-authors, right?
Yeah, and it's funny, our editor at Oxford, who I've had a long-term relationship with and I really love, but she really pushed me to not have so many co-authors because it's hard to get them all in the book jacket and things like that. And I'm like, no, I mean, this really was a collaborative effort, and the kind of linguistic capacities that members of our team have became as important as their statistical capacity, for example. And so that was really, really wonderful to have such a talented and diverse team, and they very much deserved to be on the book.
Edna or Laszlo, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah. Well, actually, I follow these discussion on religion and science for many, many years, since the 70s. And I feel that recently there's an acceleration of kind of finding path through the morass of mechanical science and the spirituality of religion, and in a way that's in a new way finding a path, because I think both of them, people realize they're leading to a dead end and limit. Scientists are always saying that religious thinking limits science. That was a big argument of the new atheists, that the new answer that humanity needs comes through denying any validity to religious thinking, and it's very hard if you get yourself into that bubble to see how that you are got yourself in the bubble that limits your being as a human being in the universe. It makes you narrow, and you may lose, even though as an atheist, I mean, you don't need to be an ethical person. You don't need religion or God. There are enough badly ethical people who are religious, but it limits the meaning and the degrees and your attitude and your connections to other human beings. So that's, I feel that lately there's enormous amount of expansion on that. I've read several, came through people who I appreciated for other things, basically are people who are kind of surprisingly going through, like cognitive scientist Hilary Putnam, or Miller. I just read a book on physics and time, that basically practicing Christian, though he interestingly doesn't believe in survival of the spirit. So it's or soul. So there are. I'm just going to stop here because I don't like to.
Well, Laszlo, I'll just say that you're right. There are the new atheists, people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, have been promoting this view that it's impossible to be a religious scientist. And what the best sociological research shows that focuses on lay citizens in the United States is that there's no difference between religious and non-religious individuals in terms of their interest in science, their knowledge of facts about science, and their attitudes more broadly. And the idea that you were mentioning about morals, survey research also shows that there are no real differences between religious individuals and non-religious individuals in terms of how moral or what type of moralities they embrace. Thank you for the comment.
The only thing is it's harder to see what religion contributes because it's not as easily quantifiable as scientific knowledge. That's the difficulty. It's not an equal, same thing.
I would say as sociologists, that's a very good point you make, but our attention is not so much on evaluating the efficacies of different systems of thought for different ends, I would say. Our attention is more turned towards, or our tools as sociologists are more about trying to figure out what scientists are doing, what they're thinking, how they're interfacing practically with religion. So we looked at things like, to what extent do scientists that say they're atheists interface ever with religious organizations? Do they interface with religious organizations when it comes to caring for children, for example? Like, sort of, what are the range of interactions? And I think studying that has some very real practical impact that's related to the kinds of things you're saying, Laszlo. So, if, for example, scientists who are atheists have positive interactions with religious people, that might provide some interesting dialogue models for addressing certain social issues together. So I think the kind of work we're doing can have an impact on understanding the conditions under which common ground efforts can occur among different groups of thought leaders, for example. So just things like that we're more interested in. These are really good questions. Thank you.
Jim or Ginger Gordon, go ahead, please. Sorry, Jim Norman or Ginger Gordon, go ahead. I don't know who's the question's from, but it's on Ginger's account. Go ahead. Unmute yourself, please.
Okay. This is all very heady stuff. What crossed my mind was the scientist Ramanujan, the mathematician and scientist, and his conversation or conflict with Hardy, who was his mentor. And he was I'm glad to see Dan Rosenblum nodding his head vigorously. I appreciate that, because Hardy said, you have to show me proof of your thinking. You have to show me how you got there. And Ramanujan said, God. That he knew what he knew and learned what he learned and had his insights from the divine source. Hardy completely could not accept that. And it was a conflict between them. So too bad he's not here now.
Thank you, Ginger.
Thank you.
Mark Hecht, go ahead, please. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is an interesting conversation. It's one of the subjects that I think about a lot, actually, as from a philosophical point of view. And obviously, in religion and science, both have a profoundly philosophical, which is the common ground. So I think I wanted to ask you, would it be a fair statement to suggest that there's two aspects to this conflict? There's the conflict that is a conflict of metaphysical, ontological, and epistemological commitments, which is a more general conflict, and methodological requirements for either of these phenomena. And then also the conflict that would be more particularistic. So the conflict between a scientist and might take umbrage at a very dogmatic or specific tradition. So then that would be a conflict between a particular religion and the scientific worldview. Whereas I'm wondering that in the scientific community, among scientists, there might be a lot of them might be much more open to the possibility of other metaphysical commitments and ontologies and epistemologies without realizing that they have a particular method, but not naysaying the other methods. And one more point, I wanted to ask what you thought about that, and then what Laszlo was talking about, that the problem with religion, it's extremely subjective, and it's not quantifiable, but I just wanted to make a comment. But that might be the thing that religion brings that's valuable to the discussion, is because it puts a very high value on subjectivity versus objectivity. And so I just wanted to get your comments on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So yes, you raise good points. So there's a discussion of epistemological conflict, and as a sociologist, I would say yes, we absolutely study that, and we're trying to figure out the kinds of epistemological conflicts that people say they have, right? So we as social scientists never know what's really in people's minds. We are studying what they say and what they do. There's a lot of, I just put the work of Ian Barber in the chat window. There's a lot of work on that. I would say that most of the work on the interface between religion and science has been centered through the fields of history, philosophy, and theology on the epistemological conflict. I liked the latter piece of your question or statement was about more particularistic conflicts. And I would say that's what we as sociologists and social scientists are probably more interested in and more equipped to study. So we would ask something like, what is it about evolution that's troubling to this particular religious group? What's at stake for them? What do they say that's what's at stake for them? How does what they believe or think or say then have an impact on particular actions, like where they send their children to school? Does that make sense? Or what kind of classes they encourage their children to go into, or what kind of careers they choose they want their children to pursue. And these are the kinds of topics that David and I have both written quite a lot about. And so those particularistic conflicts are, I think, ones that we're more interested in, and also particularistic areas of collaboration between communities and the conditions under which people embody both communities. Does that make sense? So where scientists are also involved in religious communities and religious people are involved in science, and how we think about that interface as well.
So yeah, thanks a lot. I was thinking about, this whole thing about conflict, and it reminded me, if you go all the way back to Kant, when he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason. And he's so famous because even in his time, there was the same thing, this conflict between, let's say, metaphysics, religion, and science. And metaphysics was considered a scandal. And, so the point is that, the big thing that he suggested was the limits of science. And he just said that because we can only know appearances, we can't know the thing in itself. So my question to you is that I would assume, I don't know how much traction that gets today in these circles, but it's still probably relevant, I would think. And I would imagine that the religious community would tend to agree with it, because the Critique of Practical Reason was based upon couldn't be proven scientifically, but it was necessary, for values, what have you. But the scientific community, I'm wondering, how do they feel when if they're well educated, you would think the scientists would be familiar with this work, and it makes a very incisive argument why science has to be limited, because we can only know appearances. And if they take that, seriously, then wouldn't they have to accept the religious sphere and not to be so, not to have conflict about, just to accept it as a different, maybe as a necessary a way of modality, and to realize the limits of each. So I'm just wondering what the current scientists think, based upon Kant's critique. Do they accept that, or they don't?
One of the kind of interesting questions we asked scientists, and David, you may have actually thought of this on the interview guide. I don't remember, is we asked scientists what books they had read and what they were influenced by. And I think both of us were surprised that, and no offense to the scientists on this call, who I'm sure are very philosophically reflective, but I think we were surprised at their lack of reading in certain areas, right? So their strong assertion about how the knowledge frameworks of science and religion work or don't work together, but then that they hadn't really done much devoted study in these areas, right? And it's partly the way that the academy is set up now. in global higher education functions is that scientists are really pressured to essentially run small corporations called laboratories. And there's not a lot of bandwidth for deep reflection on what it means to be a scientist in society and what that has to do with religion and religious communities or not as particular kinds of publics. So that's a very large answer to your, specific question. But I think there's something there about the lack of time for reflection on one's work and the importance of one's work in society in the scientific community. There's just being a scientist is very different now than it was 100 years ago.
Yeah, and the only thing I can add to that is that there's a stronger tradition of history and philosophy of science in mainland Europe and in the UK than you find in the United States. There are some programs in that at places like Harvard and a few other Ivy League types of institutions. But I think Elaine is right. There's sort of this the grind of doing science leaves very little time to reflect on some of these issues.
I'd like to ask you about when foreign students come to study in the US, either as PhD students or as postdocs, and this culture clash, because they may, especially from India or from Asia, they may be coming from a culture where there is no perception of this conflict between religion and science, and they come into a lab in the United States where maybe there is the belief that the two should not meet in any way. I'm thinking of, for example, Indian students or Chinese students who come to the United States, or Muslim students actually, who come to the United States and who may well practice their religion, and they come to a very completely secular, if not atheistic, environment. And I know you touched on that in your survey. I just wonder if you could speak to that.
I'll take a stab at this, and I need to note that Elaine and I have about 10 more minutes.
Sure.
That we can participate, mostly because of family commitments. The pattern that you're talking about is a hugely important one because science is a global endeavor. And when students come to the United States or the United Kingdom for their scientific training, of course, they bring their religions with them, which is an important aspect of diversity in science. And if I recall correctly, in our survey, roughly 45% of the scientists that we surveyed in the United States were born in other nations. And I think the main thing that we found is that independent of a scientist's religious beliefs, more often than not, they accommodate the religious beliefs and practices of their students. Some of the most interesting stories that we hear about in sitting down and interviewing scientists is all of the ends that non-religious or religious scientists would go to accommodate their doctoral and postdoctoral students' religious practices, whether it's changing lab meetings to avoid a conflict with religious observance, whether it's providing a space for religious practices in the lab or somewhere on campus. And one of the most interesting ones that I recall, and I was thinking about this earlier from the comment that somebody made, was that I sat down with a biologist in central England who told me that she had a Muslim student. She was a biologist, and her student rejected some of the core principles of evolution. And most people would think that a biologist would maybe kick the student out or not work with them if they rejected elements of evolution. But she found a way to work on the project that actually did tie into evolution, but in a way that was not in conflict for the student herself. And more often than not, scientists accommodate the practices of their students. We did hear some instances of discrimination, but I think that they, at least anecdotally, were less prevalent than instances of accommodation.
Excuse me, I worked at a large global bank for many years, and some years ago, and I can tell you within IT in New York, in the finance and other industries, 70% roughly are from India, I would say. And it's a mix of Hindus and Muslims. Anyway, so a number of years ago, there's an announcement that comes out saying that they're opening a prayer room at this location in the big building. And I was pretty surprised at that. And of course, they did it because of the large number of Muslim staff members who were coming in. And this would have been completely unheard of but before that, in prior years. So I just thought I'd mention that. Dan, you have your hand up and for a while. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, actually, I just raised it again. It was up residually from before. But, when you look at and this relates to something that Anuradha had raised earlier on this notion of having in India a meeting with a scientific meeting opening with a dedication to Saraswati. And the point being that you would never have a scientific meeting in the US invoking a religious theme. But I wonder if to some extent that's overdetermined in the US. And here's what I mean by that. Because on the one hand, yes, you have this distinctly Western, or per Anu's comment, maybe distinctly only Anglo conflict between science and religion as one possible cause. The other possible cause for not having that kind of a thing is the history of distinct independence of religion from other things in the US, going back even before the Bill of Rights. Article 6 of the Constitution says no religious test shall be required to hold any office in the US. So already in Article 6, you have this notion that religion and at least the political and governmental sphere are to be held completely separate and distinct. And clearly that doesn't bother, as I mentioned in the chat earlier, implied Dr. Francis Collins, who's head of the NIH, who's a devout Catholic. But I wonder if one of the reasons you would never have that kind of thing here is because some groups would be left out and there would be a whole lot of hurt because of that. I speak as a secular Jew, like a third generation secular Jew. Religion, belief in a personal God is meaningless to me. But I would be really angry if a government or formal event had to include an element of Christian, Muslim, or for that matter, Jewish worship. I mean, I was like, you're leaving me out. I mean, so I wonder to what extent, at least in the US, that issue is one of the reasons why you would not have science explicitly included in a religion rather explicitly included in scientific meetings. And it may be hard to sort out those two reasons, the sort of general Anglo or Western conflict versus this distinctly American strict separation.
Yeah, you're touching on issues, Daniel, that have to do with the history of knowledge making, the history of legal structures as related to religion, which I think are very important issues. And so they're not the kind of issues that we can access well through a study like the one that David and I did. But they're important backdrop and interpretive issues. So it may be that scientists in the US so readily go to independence as a way to understand the relationship between religious and scientific ways of knowing, because of that kind of modal interpretation that you have expressed of one of leaving religion out of things as being the de facto way of dealing with religion and society in the US. I think that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about it quite the way that you put it, but it's an interesting thing to try on as an interpretation of some of the findings that we have.
The only thing I would add to that, and I was trying to type it out, but I'm a slow typer. There's a great book called Secularism and State Policies Towards Religion by a guy named Amit Kuru. And he talks about assertive, passive versus assertive secularism. And when you were posing your question, I was mostly thinking about France, where there's a very assertive secularism and a very strict separation of religion from institutional life. And my sense is that separation quells conflict in many ways, or even primarily, but what it doesn't often solve is the issue of religious symbolism. So people might not talk about religion at French institutions because of this sort of official culture, But if you're wearing religious symbols, such as a cross around your neck or anything else, that can become a basis for discrimination. But broadly speaking, I think the fact that there's such a strict separation of it is part of the reason that the conflict narrative is relatively low in France.
Okay, we'll let you go in 1 minute if we can just fit in one more question from Jim Norman, who has had his hand up for a long time. Go ahead, Jim.
Not that long, but thanks, David. I appreciate it. It's not really a question, but a comment and a request for comment on the comment. And that is, I'm neither a religious person nor a scientist. And I've often been puzzled by the conflict between religion and science. For example, evolution seems to me to be such a miraculous event. I don't understand why fundamentalist religiously people can't accept the idea of evolution as evidence to support their religion. Why do they even bother to deny it? It's such a miracle. And on the other hand, I don't really see why scientists would think about precluding themselves from religious thought, one way or the other. It's always puzzled me.
I don't think people are thinking, I'm just giving you my gut response to what you said, because you asked for a statement in response to your statement.
Thank you.
I don't think that, so, okay, let me start back. This group strikes me as a group of people who values reflection to a great deal. And I don't think that the everyday scientist, for example, or the everyday religious person is trying as hard as you all are to think through, like, how can my belief system be consistent with my practices? Does that make sense? And so I think this is something that sociology quickly uncovers, is that people say they think lots of things, and then they do different kinds of things, right? So that belief systems and practices are often pretty disconnected. And I wonder if that's a piece of responding to what you're thinking about, that yes, people believe seemingly inconsistent things. Like, there's nothing really inherently about being a scientist that would say you can't be a religious person. But when people start to talk about the ways in which science and religion as knowledge systems are in conflict with one another, then the everyday person interpretation of that larger, like, metaphysical conversation is, oh, whoa, that must mean people called scientists and people called religious people are two totally different groups of people. And so here's where sociology can come alongside. I feel like I'm giving some sort of evangelistic statement for my discipline, but I mean, I think here is where social science is helpful, is it can say, oh gosh, like, that's not actually true. There are these people who exist, right? And that sort of confronts some perhaps, metaphysical kinds of things that people are thinking, right? And so that's a quick response to what you're saying. A good point, good comment.
Thank you.
I want to mention Scientific American for many years had a column called The Amateur Scientist. I forget the guy who wrote it for many years originally, but when he died or retired or whatever, they were looking for a replacement. They found a guy whose name I have blanked out on, and they selected him. And then it came up kind of casually that he was not just a Christian, but I think an evangelical Christian. And there was an enormous controversy over this, just whether he should be allowed to write a column, The Amateur Scientist, which was an extremely popular column in Scientific American. I can't remember now how it got resolved. This was maybe you know the story and can tell us, I don't know. But it was quite remarkable. And I also want to mention that some years ago, I was very surprised to learn that one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century, Theodosius Dobzhansky, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, who was one of the founders of the modern synthesis in biology, was a churchgoer. And I found this out because I read a memoir of one of his students who spoke about this. And now I tried to find out what he really believed, you know, and I could never get that answered. But he was an avid churchgoer and, you know, never, didn't see the conflict. Anyway, Joelle, go ahead. Joelle Freeman, go ahead. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for this. And it's really been interesting and enlightening. And just so happy to hear that this research is being done. And I think it's extremely valuable. I have two things. One, is there any thought or discussion of taking this kind of information kind of from the observational, the quantifying, you know, of the different phenomena that are happening in different societies, and working with maybe, I don't know if it would be in the branch of sociology. Frankly, I don't know much about sociology. I apologize. Working with maybe different and interdisciplinary kind of like efforts to take this information and maybe use it to support individuals who may be struggling with this, who might not necessarily be in a position mentally or aware that, you know, resources like this happen, for example, are available, excuse me. For example, like I went to UGA, as we had talked about before the program started, and you know, there's all these wonderful geology professors who came to Athens, Georgia from all these Ivy League colleges throughout the United States. And I'd say they probably had a pretty big culture shock themselves coming there. And then I come from the other side, probably one of the students they had that had the most fundamentalist background. And so yeah, oh, okay, I see Elaine already commented the answer. So okay, I'll look into that. I don't know if you want to say more. And then my second question, just sorry, actually, I think I lost the thread of it. That's fine. Sorry.
Joelle, well, I'm sorry, go David or Elaine, go ahead if you were going to comment. Then I just want to ask Joelle something.
I was just going to comment with respect to your first question. Elaine noted that the American Association for the Advancement of Science has a major program called DOSER. It's Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, and they're working in that space. Elaine and I have also, in the last year or so, started a new effort where we're taking these results to the scientific community and also to the religious community and policy leaders. And we've been organizing talks and workshops with scientists in the locations that we studied. And so far we've done 2 places in the United States. We'll be going to the United Kingdom, India. Mexico City was not part of our project, but we've added that to start a footprint south, which I thought about earlier with somebody else's question, and then also Hong Kong. And so what we're trying to do is bring this information back to various thought leaders in the hopes that the practical implications of it could be an opportunity for dialogue and provide resources to people such as the ones that you were speaking about.
Awesome.
Joelle, I have a question. Now, I may be misremembering this, but for everyone's benefit, Joelle is a geologist and did a project with Engineers Without Borders in Africa. And Joelle, I think, and if I'm wrong, correct me, that you and your team had a bit of culture shock because wherever you were in Africa, I can't remember now, of course, religion was so infused in the culture that there was, you know, there was a lot of the locals. I can't remember whether they, you know, insisted that you guys go with them to some church or something like that. Maybe I'm misremembering this.
No, you're not at all. So yes, I was a mentor for the Columbia University chapter of Engineers Without Borders for about a year, including being a travel mentor. And we did a project to install some groundwater wells to provide a clean water supply for a village about 1 hour to the north of Accra. So, you know, it was an amazing experience for me all around. But yes, it was quite difficult to see that in a place, where there's very little access to medical care, literally no clinic at all in this particular village. The schools are limited as well. And, obviously the infrastructure is not there, which is part of, what our project was about. But there were, I think, at least 6 different denominations of Christian churches in that one village. And they don't even have a first aid station or anything. It's frustrating, but yeah, they did, the individuals in that village were so acculturized to Christianity that they were more receptive. They weren't that receptive, sorry, to our, concepts of teaching them about sanitation and hand washing before going to the new wells, and all these ideas we had to broach with ultimate delicacy to not alienate them. Yet they expected us to pray with them before every group meeting we had with their elders. And so of course we did that, and just happily obliged whatever we could do to be of assistance. It's a secular organization, but we understand you have to meet them where they are. So yeah, that's just a very small experience I had, and it's very subjective. I think it, Ghana itself is extremely varied, but yeah, it was eye-opening.
We talk a lot in the book about ways in which religion comes up in scientists' work, and one of the themes that we describe in the book is when they interface with the public, such as what you're describing. So even if a scientist herself is not religious, it's often the case, especially for public-facing scientists, that they might interface with a religious public and have to keep that in mind in how they advance the science that they're doing.
Oh, you reminded me.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
You reminded me of the second thing. It's not, I guess the reason I forgot is because it's not exactly a question, but being a pretty open person, and that I'm secular and or probably atheist, but I don't really care whether I am or not. And I'm a scientist, and it's my field of work. I just it's so frustrating to be in a position where if I ever wanted to hold political office in the United States, that would be a huge barrier for me. And I wish it wasn't that way, it's just sort of a little bit of venting, because I do think there's probably a lot of qualified individuals who also face that barrier. God has to be part of your campaign, your platform, or you will be ostracized. You will be, it's sad. And I hope that, maybe in a couple of decades, maybe we'll make some progress on that, or maybe we already are. But overall, I know it's not great at this time.
Yeah, Joelle, you raised really good points, and atheists, people who say they're atheists, are very much often discriminated against in U.S. society. There's some really important sociological work about that topic. Actually, another project we have going on through the Religion Public Life program at Rice on experiences of religious discrimination and victimization also shows, in line with other work, that atheists are among the more discriminated against groups in the U.S. in the kind of ways that you mentioned. I really appreciated too. I wanted to say what you said about highlighting cultural competency, which dovetails with David's comment that whether or not a scientist is personally herself religious, the need to understand religion to some extent might be necessary in order to translate scientific work to particular cultural contexts. And so that's where, we almost as scientists say, this work is important practically to give scientists kind of cultural competencies with religion so that they can interface around scientific work in particular kinds of religious communities. So that you just raised some really great points in what you said.
I want to call on Sal Infantino next. And Sal, before you talk, I want to mention that Sal is Italian by birth, though he lives here. And he's a retired cardiologist. But in the book, they talk a lot about Italy and scientists in Italy. And it's very interesting because in Italy, of course, Catholicism is the air, so to speak. And it's an interesting perspective. Sal, go ahead, please. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, so you took the spirit of my question immediately.
Sorry,
So,
I stepped on you.
As David mentioned, I am Italian, and my journey in science has been very much conditioned by Galileo's experience with the Inquisition. And I would like to know, in your studies, did you address the issue of interference by religion in science, and what were your findings, particularly in Italy and more broadly in Western civilization? Thank you.
Did you want to say, David, or is it okay if I go? Yeah. So again, I proceed humbly. I'm describing 5 years of work and summarizing literally decades of historical work in 3 sentences. So Italy is a super interesting context, as you well raise, and definitely Italian scientists felt like the Catholic Church under certain conditions interfered in science and scientific work. So that definitely came up. I would say what also came up is that scientists felt like there wasn't any conflict between their own Catholic understanding and their scientific work. And in fact, Catholicism was so much a part of almost the air you breathed. David reminded me once of the great, metaphor about the fish saying, what is water? Because they're swimming in it. And so Catholicism, we had this really memorable interview with a scientist in Italy who said up and down, he was absolutely not religious. And when we went into his office, had literally the largest Bible I have ever seen laid out in like pounds of Bible laid out in his office. And I'm like, I take it at face value what he says. That's our responsibility as social science to write down what he says. We're also observing these religious symbols in his office, and those are all happening at the same time, his words and the symbols. And that's the kind of thing we need to document, which is a very complex situation related to religion and science in Italy. So you just raised some great points. The Italian context was one of the most interesting, I think, that we studied.
Pam Berglund, go ahead, please, and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. I love this topic because it's been since I was 12, 13 years old when I started learning about the birth of the origin of the species that I began to question religion. So that's where my head is, that they can't be together. But my question for you, either David or Elaine, is when you say there's a disparity between religion and scientists, are you referring to scientists who study or doctors? And because we have so many doctors from all these countries, so where is the distinction? What was the area that you were trying to determine?
So that's a great question, Pam. Thank you so much. And we were focusing exclusively on scientists who are working in universities or research institutes in the 8 regions that we studied. I think because some basic science takes place in medical schools, there are some areas where there were scientists who also had MDs, but they were not practicing physicians. And the question you're getting at is important for another reason. When we think about conflict in science, the 2 main areas that epistemological conflict arises are related to the origins of man and in evolutionary biology and the origins of the universe. And even the scientists working specifically within those fields, so specialties represent a very small proportion of individuals in physics and biology. The types of conflict that you see on the medical side or on the applications of science are where in the broader public we start to see evidence of moral concerns, a sort of moral conflict with science, whether it's doctors doing things with stem cells or genetic technologies and things to that effect. And those concerns are more often in medicine, and the public has issues with them, and they're distinct from the production of knowledge as it relates to basic science.
Okay, Eric Sandhusen, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Enjoying this very much. And you've touched a little bit upon this in the previous answers to questions. A few years ago, I was back in the congregational Christian church that I was raised in, and I noticed for the first time that one of the stained glass windows in the sanctuary had Darwin, Freud, and Einstein there with all the apostles and Jesus. And I thought, well, okay, that kind of explains certain things about my upbringing and about my current humanism and secularism. So I guess my question is, obviously, it's not just what do scientists think about religion, but it's also what does religion think about science? And so I'm wondering if you have developed any kind of, typography or hierarchy of religious thought and how that may or may not correlate to the scientists' answers that you've received.
Yeah, so I can't write as quickly as you can ask questions. I'm trying to put resources in the chat window as well. So my colleague Christopher Scheidel and I have a book out from 2018 called Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think. And that is looks specifically at US religious people, so not international. There's not a lot of cross-national comparative work on religion and science, looking at religious populaces, although one of our former junior colleagues, Esther Chan, has some initial work out on that topic. And so definitely, I mean, some of you have been asking about Judaism. Within the US, there's not the kind of presumption of conflict in Jewish communities, although I would say with the notable exception of the Orthodox community, where there are some of the same kinds of conflicts involving the nature of humans and God's involvement of the world that there are in evangelical Christian communities. And there, we also looked at different traditions within Islam that are present in the US as well, as a range of Christian traditions, mainline Protestant Christian traditions, so Methodists, Episcopalians, others, compared to evangelical Christians, looking at both predominantly white, Hispanic, and Black congregations, and as well as looking at Catholics in the US. So that book has a pretty broad range of information about that topic. I'll put it in the chat window for you.
By the way, I'm going to get the copy of all the chat, and I will. There's you're posting so many great resources and so many good things there. I will post the contents of that probably on our Facebook page, our public Facebook page, and I'm not sure where else, but for everyone's benefit, I will post it because those are some great resources. By the way, apropos of this question, I don't remember if this was either of you, David and Elaine, who said this on the interview you did it on the New Books Network, but it may have been somebody else. I can't remember. Someone was relating a story that they were in a supermarket or a drugstore, and or maybe at a party, and an acquaintance or something said something along the lines of they were afraid to send their kid to a good school, a good college. Okay, so it was you who's, go ahead, tell the story before I butcher it. Go ahead.
Oh, that is a story I've told that actually happened to me, David Bland, a couple, I use that story some with talks. So I was actually in my graduate school, early graduate school career, worked in a research project for my advisor, where I went to church Bible studies as part of my research to try to figure out how they were talking about changes in family forms. And I had a really great interaction with a woman who, asked me what I did. And I said, well, I'm a PhD student at Cornell University, studying, different religious groups. And she said, yuck, I wouldn't want my kid to go to Cornell. And I was like totally in a different framing. I was like, because she wants her kid to go to Harvard because she thinks Harvard's a better school than Cornell. I was like really not on her page. And I kind of became curious about what she was saying. I said, why would you want your kid to go to Cornell? Cornell's a great reputation. And she said, well, I would be afraid that the scientists there might take him away from his faith. And I should have told that story in the first question you asked, because that was kind of the personal reason that I initially decided to study what scientists think about religion. My husband's actually a particle physicist, and I just got really curious about this idea. I was like, is that really true? Are scientists like all out to eat young Christian children for lunch? Or like, how is that actually true, right? What do the range of scientists think about religion? So that's kind of a personal story of mine that I use sometimes.
We totally are.
Don't say that, Joelle. I told Elaine and David that we're a lot like a church in some ways. And one of the ways is that we have a final appeal for donations. So I know our Zoom master has put the link in the chat window on how you can donate. But I'll just say it also, it's ethicalfocus.org/donate. And you'll get what amounts to our virtual donation basket. If you'd like to learn more about us and who we are, you can check out our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email the office at admin@ethicalfocus.org, and someone will get back to you. And I'll ask Rob Eigenbrod, our Zoom master, to put those two links in the chat window. I can't thank you both enough, Elaine and David, for joining us this Sunday morning. It was really a terrific talk, and we had many, many great comments in the chat window. I think this has really been memorable. And we probably had about 100 people, if you count the number of people who were couples watching on One Connection. So it was a really good turnout. I want to thank you very much again for joining us. And I personally look forward to your continued work in this area.
Thank you. That is, we're really proud of our next book together. This is the first book that David and I have written, just the two of us, Varieties of Atheism in Science. That's coming out in July. So shameless plug, I hope you'll invite us back again.
Oh, you got it.
Really fun to be with you all.
We will absolutely invite you back. It's coming out in July?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, around September, October, I'll probably be in touch.
Yeah, really, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you very much, David.
Take care. Thank you. It was very fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.